Welcome to In Conversation with David Frum. I'm your host, Sean Spear, editor-at-large at The Hub. I'm glad to be back in conversation with David for another installment of our bi-weekly video and podcast series on the key issues concerning Canadian policy and politics. In today's conversation, we'll discuss the latest developments in Washington, as well as David's reflections on Canada's federal election campaign as it hits its final week. David, thanks as always for joining us.
Thank you.
David, it's been a relatively quiet week, seemingly, in Washington, and I wanted to try to understand what you think is going on. Just in recent days, for instance, Trump has backed down on his threat to fire Jerome Powell, the central bank governor, and has even talked about, quote, being very nice in trade talks with Washington. What do you think is happening?
Well, part of it is they are busy with other scandals that don't directly impinge on Canada. These projects of grabbing people from American streets and putting bags over their head and stuffing them on buses or planes to take them to prisons in El Salvador, that's going badly for the president. The Supreme Court has rebuked the project. There is another flare-up around Trump's Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, who was caught
Yes.
a second time communicating incredibly sensitive information via Signal. Signal is a signaling app that is pretty secure, but it's lodged on private phones that are not even slightly secure.
Yes.
And so you have to presume that Hegseth gave away the dates and times and flight paths of American warcraft to the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, the North Koreans, anybody else who wanted to have them. I mean, it's unbelievably stupid and reckless. And then finally, there's a mini scandal involving Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem. Kristi Noem had a bag stolen at an Easter lunch with a lot of cash in it, and in itself is just a day in the big city. But the way it's being reported is you're supposed to understand something more is going on. And what's rumored is that she has improper relationships, intimate relationships with people in her office, and that's why there's so much cash in her bag, and that the theft gives an opportunity to sort of wink at the reader. There's something going on here that we wouldn't normally report, but you might want to know about.
Uh, there's a lot there. Let me follow up on the subject of trade negotiations with China. The administration has taken a hard line, of course, up until now, ramping up tariffs to extraordinary levels. What do you think explains the ostensible about face that we've seen in recent days with with the president rather talking about, quote, playing nice with the
Yeah.
Chinese?
Um, so understand it really needs to be stressed again and again, because as the Trump people try to retro engineer their insane and stupid policy into something that is at least intelligible, they keep wanting to emphasize they have a trade war with China and want people to forget they actually have a trade war with the world.
Hmm.
Every trading nation has been targeted by Trump tariffs. It's not just about China. And any China specific explanation is an after the fact invention, not a before the fact reason. But some of the less bizarre people around Donald Trump, including his Secretary of the Treasury, are trying to dial back the trade war to make it something like a normal policy. And again, I think it's all too late. I think they're not, the idea that you are going to wage a trade war against all your allies and then say, oh, sorry, changed our mind. Why don't you all join us in a trade war against China? That's not very plausible. Meanwhile, they're confronted with the prospect that there are not going to be goods on the shelves for Christmas.
Yes.
Trump had apparently a secret meeting with representatives of Target, Walmart, and Home Depot, the three biggest
Yes.
retailers in the United States, where they said, "You understand that by fall our shelves will be empty. It's going to look like the Soviet Union under Leonid Brezhnev, Donald Trump's America." And so Trump's panicking. There are financial news that is panicking, and we're beginning to see bellwether layoffs in sensitive industries, especially automotives. You know, um, many retailers have been able to lay in inventories. I'm told that there's enough wine and Scotch whiskey in the United States for the next decade. But the automotive industry does not keep big inventories. So if these supply chains are interrupted, the auto industry can't function and will be laying off auto workers.
No. On the subject of internal battles within the administration on the tariffs themselves, we've seen reports in recent days that the Treasury Secretary and the Commerce Secretary are working behind the scenes to effectively thwart the efforts of hardliners like Pete Navarro in the administration when it comes to tariffs. Are we in an intra White House stalemate on the subject of tariffs? And if so, who ultimately wins the war in your mind?
Yeah. Look, when people report on an administration like this one. There's so many bizarre and weird characters that the less bizarre and weird characters get a very undeserved good press.
Yeah.
So instead of thinking about hardliners versus softliners or crazy people versus rational people, I think you ought to think about the Trump White House as being divided into three major camps, all beginning with the letter
Okay.
C:
Okay.
crooks, crackpots, cowards. Um, and obviously, the cowards are the least crackpotty. Some of the cowards are also crooks. But the cowards are people who do know better, but have yielded to this point. That one of the options that a Secretary of the Treasury has is to say, Mr. President, you start this trade war with the world. I am not only resigning, but I'm going to make a big stink about it. I'm going to be
Yes.
I'm going to be testifying in front of Congress. I am going to be giving speeches to economic clubs in New York and Chicago. I am going to lay my body on the train track to protect the American economy. A person with a little bit of courage would do that. Besant wants the job more than he wants to do anything with the job. And obviously, he's more intelligent than others. He's less crazy than others. If it were up to him, he would want to have a more normal economic policy, but he's not willing to risk staying Secretary of the Treasury. That's priority one, self-preservation. And you see that again and again. So, yes, there are factional disputes, and crazy people tend to lose factional disputes because they're crazy. Um, and so a lot of it comes down to the crooks versus the cowards. And on this one, the crooks may come into alignment with the cowards because the policy is so demented. Um, but it's really all too late to do a lot of good because um, at this point, Trump's options are roll back the policy altogether and still see permanent damage to America's financial standing. But the project Besant is trying to sell, which is to create some kind of united front against China, that's too late. That should have been done at the beginning, and it required both management of the alliances and management of U.S. public opinion. Trump told Americans his economic policy would bring cheap and easy and immediate prosperity.
Yes.
And reshoring manufacturing means a lot of years of hardship, struggle, and deteriorated standards of living. And so if you want to do it, you have to let people know what's coming.
That's a fascinating heuristic. Cowards, crackpots, and crazy. Something, no doubt, that we'll come back to in coming episodes. If you'll permit me, though, I have to ask: in that framework, where does Vice President J.D. Vance belong?
Oh, he his ideologically he aligns with the crazies because he espouses extreme protectionism. I think his friendship group are the crooks, but his natural spiritual state of being is cowardice.
uh, in addition to some of the issues that we've talked about in Washington, I want to ask specifically about something you alluded to in your first answer, and that is that Canada seems to be less on the radar in recent days.
Yeah.
There's been less talk, for instance, of the country becoming the 51st state. Is there anything to read into that? Is it partly a reflection, for instance, David, that the president is satisfied with Prime Minister Carney's commitment to renegotiating the trade and security agreement after the election, and for now that has in effect bought his silence?
Um, that is a imposing an external reactionality on it. It's also possible Trump's just got bored. It's also possible that he's got other fish to fry, other obsessions and will-o'-the-wisps. And I am skeptical that Carney will find it as easy as he thinks
Yes.
to open this negotiation because um, Carney's had an easy time in this pre-election and then election period in that he's competing against a primary opponent who Canadians rightly or wrongly associate as somehow pro-Trump or anyway less anti-Trump than Carney. So Carney has a lot of running room to do deals with Trump to say, look, I will stand up to him more than I insist my opponent will stand up to him, fairly or not. Um, but I also want to do business with him, which my opponent, fairly or not, is thought to want to do. When this election is over, um, if Carney should win, he may find himself with different opponents. The most lucrative place to be in Canadian politics will be to attack Carney as a sellout to Trump. And there will be
Yes.
politicians ready to do that. Now, that may not be a responsible thing, but a lot of conservatives will come out of this election feeling Carney was pretty irresponsible to us, and we don't owe him a great gift of responsibility in return, and we will do unto him as he did unto us. And he may find it That's the thing that Trump keeps forgetting. Other countries have politics too. There's a lot of pent up anger in Canada. It will not be, if Carney gets on the plane and is seen going to Mar-a-Lago or even the White House and clinking glasses with Trump, that may be politically expensive inside Canada at a time when feeling is running so strong. Trump will want from Canada some show of submission before he relents on his trade action. And Canadians will, I think, expect some show of remission on the trade actions before there's any reconciliation. And Trump is always worried about saving his own face. He never thinks that other people have faces to save as well.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, David, and something we'll talk about after the election. But one wonders if after the honeymoon period is over, if winning the prime ministership might feel like something like a consolation prize because of the
Yes.
excruciating decisions that the new prime minister will need to make because of this gap between what will be
Yeah.
required to secure a deal with the Trump administration and, as you say, Canadians' appetite for what will no doubt be characterized as concessions.
Yeah.
If you'll permit me, I thought I would take the remaining time to ask you a bit about the election campaign. It's not something we've talked about a great deal on this podcast, in part because of all of the extraordinary developments in Washington. But of course, you're also an astute observer of Canadian politics. I won't ask you about some of the particularities of the different campaigns, but I wanted to ask about some big picture trends that I think we've seen over the past several weeks. One of them is the solid lead that the Liberals have had, really from the beginning, rooted in the public's favorable impression of Mark Carney. Someone, David, has characterized it to me as a flight to safety.
Yes.
What do you think of that analysis?
That's pretty good. And it may also explain another strange thing. And you're very kind to call me an astute observer, but I think I'm an astute observer of Canadian politics as it was. And
Mm.
we have to do this now, migration to Canadian politics as it is. And those of us of a certain age are at a disadvantage. I'm not at home in a world in which the conservatives consistently outperform the liberals with young people. Um,
Yes.
that's a strange world, and it is, I think, the flight to safety. That the older people who are more have more to lose, less, maybe the spirit of adventure. The younger people who have less to lose and more spirit of adventure, and so Carney represents the safe choice. Polevra represents some kind of change. It's hard to know exactly what the change is, but that's the word he uses all the time. So we've got this strange dynamic. We have this polarizing sexual dynamic. At the same time, we have this other dynamic of really weak party identification. I mean,
Yes.
am I right that the conservatives were at one point up 22 in the polls? They're now down 5. So theoretically, a 27-point swing in the
Yes.
span of a few months. That doesn't happen. No other country is unpolarized enough to have such a thing. That could never happen, never mind in the United States, but in Britain or in France or in Germany.
Yes. Yeah, precisely right. One gets a sense that party attachment is much more limited here, and that there is a much larger share of accessible or undecided voters demonstrated, as you say, by this extraordinary shift that we've seen really starting sometime in roughly mid-January, as late as January 5th or so, just as President Trump is set to be inaugurated. Betting markets have the probability of Pierre Poilievre becoming prime minister at something approaching 99%.
Yeah.
So as you say, there's been this extraordinary
And, and
swing
part of
swing
it,
in our politics.
and part of it is due to the unique standing of the Liberal Party of Canada as one of the most ruthless power-seeking entities in the world. I mean, just when Kamala Harris was replaced Joe Biden, she did an interview when
Yes.
she was asked, "What of Biden's policies would you change?" And she said, in effect, nothing. Whereas in Canada, the Kamala Harris candidate said, everything you don't like, out the window. Everything you do like, in the front, in the window. We, all that stuff we said we are irrevocably, passionately committed to, that it was the very essence of our being in September. We think we hate it more than you. It's gone.
That's indeed the case. In fact, for the past 2 years, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has campaigned against the carbon tax. In the end, as you say, Prime Minister Carney relented and repealed the carbon tax. And a majority of Canadians polls tell us credit Mark Carney for getting rid of the carbon tax, as opposed to Pierre Poilievre essentially creating the political conditions for it. I want to take up the subject of generational polarization because it's, as you say, it's tended in a direction that is quite different than one would expect, particularly in other Anglo-American countries. The Conservatives are leading with younger voters, and the Liberals have a commanding lead with older voters. So much so, David, that you may not have seen, but in the closing days of this campaign, the Conservatives are running an ad targeting old white men golfing, a constituency that normally would be a core part of a center right party's base. What do you make of that?
Well, um, I think it shows a little political correctness on the conservatives' part that they made the people they're angry at men when it's really women. I think the core Canadian dynamic is this. When the price of housing goes up as much as it has in the major Canadian cities,
Yes.
uh, it has two effects. One effect is, and this is why young people lean right, is it prices young people out of the housing market. The second effect is it makes the owners of those houses much richer than they were before. And uh, because men tend to die off earlier, there are a lot of older women who are sitting on assets that have probably doubled in value over the past 10 years. And so that ad really, it's not about old white men golfing. It's about widows and divorced women occupying very large apartments in the center of Toronto and Vancouver that, their nieces and nephews would like to enjoy instead. So the project of bringing down the price of housing inevitably means reducing the value of other people's assets. And that
Yes.
is a conflict of interest, very hard to resolve.
Yes. Yeah, I would just say in parentheses, the Conservatives' lack of support in cities is a double-edged sword when it comes to this issue. On one hand, the political costs of talking about bringing housing pricing down in theory is lower, but as you say, it disproportionately puts them in conflict with older homeowners, and I think that's at least partly reflected in the strong polling amongst older Canadians for the Liberal Party. I want to take up the subject of the outcome of this election more generally. We've talked about the lack of party identification and the number of people who are seemingly accessible. We've also, however, seen that this has become essentially a two-party race,
Yeah.
David, between the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party, who are poised to win a larger share combined between the two of them than any two parties in Canadian federal politics since the 1930s. For all of the stories we tell us of having a multi-party system, at least in English Canada, that's seemingly no longer the case. What do you think that might tell us, if anything?
Um, I'm going to go out on a limb here and really speculate because I don't pretend I truly understand it. But a way that I think about it is there are two master issues in Canadian politics. One is U.S. Canada, and the
Yes.
other is center region, especially Quebec. Um, when U.S. Canada is to the fore, uh, that's a more natural two-party issue because the Liberals and the Conservatives can each come up with a stance on U.S. Canada that appeals to a very broad part of the population. When it's regional, you get this kind of crack up of the central parties
Yes.
because the people in the West and people in Quebec are going to look at these issues very differently from people in the center. And so that has been since the failure of the constitutional reform projects of the 80s and 90s. Canada's been very much driven by regional issues for not only language but resources. And so
Yes.
Canadians look for regional champions. But now it's the U.S. Canada issue that's at the fore, and so the things consolidate a little bit. That's just my working hypothesis. There may
No,
be
I think
more to it. You may have a better idea, but that's the best I can do.
No, I think that's thoughtful. I think that's no doubt part of it. There's also been, I think, a strategic effort on the part of the Liberal Party for now several election cycles to essentially consolidate parts of the center left or left. I think on a working hypothesis, one that I think is being bared out in this election, that a consolidated left defeats a consolidated center left defeats a consolidated center right. nine times out of 10 in Canadian elections. The Conservative Party is poised to win perhaps its largest share of the popular vote uh, in the party's existence, at least dating back to 2003, even larger than Stephen Harper's majority in 2011, and may still find itself on the opposition benches.
Yeah, that may be also a very temporary achievement by the Liberals. Because of Trump, the Canadian left has been much more subdued than it has been. But the
Yes.
Canadian left, its defining issue is accusing people of genocide. Israelis, Canadians, doesn't matter. Just genocide, genocide, genocide. And so Mark Carney has two things. He's been protected from a left-wing mutiny by he's tilted anti-Israel, so that assuages the urge to call Canada, so to accuse Israel of genocide, and the explosion, the collapse of the false accusations against Canadian history has made it temporarily embarrassing, especially in the face of Trump's challenge and the surge of patriotism for the Canadian left to accuse Canadians of genocide. But I don't think either of those things is permanent. That if there is a Carney government, there will be demands from to refund Hamas-linked charities in Gaza. There will be once again the accusation of blame pointed at Canadian heroes of the past. The theme of patriotism will not sit well with the Canadian far left, and Carney may find this difficult to manage. He's never had to manage a political party before. He's never had to
Yes.
manage public opinion before. And maybe he'll be effortlessly and instantly good at all of those things, but they're hard. And even people who've done them for a long time are often defeated by them.
Yeah, well said. I agree. And I would just add that if these polls hold up, the Liberals are poised to win something like 50% of traditional NDP support, which means that that caucus for which Mr. Carney will be responsible will have a broad and diverse set of views and interests, which will ostensibly make that job even harder. Before we wrap up, David, I wanted to ask about a subject we've talked a lot about over our now approaching 80 episodes of our bi-weekly now weekly conversations, and that is the spilling over of diaspora politics into the Canadian body politic. We've had instances in this election campaign where the different parties have had to abandon candidates because of their attachment to old world conflicts, or even to other governments around the world. Why don't you just reflect on how that's played out in this campaign, and maybe what it tells us more broadly about this risk to Canadian political life?
Well, I would see it as a kind of progress. Abandoning candidates who are disloyal is a great first step to not recruiting them in the first place.
Yes.
But in the previous decade, those candidates weren't abandoned. You were quite free to enter into parliament and say, I was elected by such and such a constituency, but I'm really here to represent China or Russia or India or Hezbollah. Those are my real constituents. I think Canadians are aware now of the danger in a way that they were less aware in the 2010s. And the parties are taking steps. So that's a beginning. I think sometimes when you hear more reports of a problem, it means the problem is getting better, not that the
Hmm.
problem is getting worse. If there is an upsurge of prosecutions of white collar crime, it doesn't mean that there's more white collar crime. It means that the police are suddenly paying more attention to it. Um,
Yeah.
and I think we should take it in that spirit. But this is something that really needs to be taken seriously. I'm glad to see that the parties in a political way have begun. And now intelligence and law enforcement need to get involved too.
Yeah, as we wrap up, I just want to close with the subject we've talked about in the past. We've even talked a bit about today, and that is that the next prime minister will inherit or assume responsibility for two of the biggest issues that for a prime minister can face, and that is as you put it, the Canada-U.S. relationship and national unity, and the potential for these issues to in fact intersect. David, one
Yeah.
can envision a negotiation with the Trump administration that involves potential trade-offs between Quebec dairy farmers, Ontario auto manufacturing, and Western Canadian energy resources. How do you think the next prime minister will be able to navigate those issues, particularly when facing a Trump administration, which ostensibly is not going to be very magnanimous?
Yeah, that is, it's not just about the negotiation. I don't believe there should be an early negotiation. I don't believe there will be an early negotiation. There shouldn't be a negotiation because the American position is deteriorating faster than Canadian permission is deteriorating. So
Yes.
Canada would be much better off to postpone any talks until closer to the U.S. midterm elections when Trump is going to be sweating than to do it
Interesting.
now. His power has begun to fade, but it's not fading as fast as it will fade later. So do not be hasty to enter into negotiations. And uh, look, with the Quebec there, I don't know why it hasn't long ago been that the government should go farm to farm with a checkbook. So, but what would it cost to make you never grow milk again? Just like there must be some number at which you will take your entire family to Honolulu, or well, I guess we can't go to American states anymore, but take them to Portugal. Just here on us, on the taxpayer, it's cheaper. Just close this farm and let us buy milk from America. Um, uh, Name your price. But the real strain is as Canada negotiates, one of the most important levers Canada will have is export taxes on things the Americans cannot replace. Potash, Quebec and Ontario hydroelectricity, certain kinds of minerals, natural gas. And those always have a regional component.
Yes.
The government falls back on import restrictions, which hurt Canadians, rather than the export restrictions, which also hurt Canadians, but which really have imposed equal pain on both sides of the border, unlike the imports, which hurt Canadians much more than they hurt Americans. So that's where the test is going to be. Can Canada successfully put an export tax on potash and natural gas and hydro? Will the provinces go along with that? That will be the strain on national unity. The most effective pressure tactic is the one that the provinces will object to the most.
Well, we'll have to take that issue up after this election. David, thanks for sharing your thoughts as we head into the final weekend. I won't ask you for any predictions, but is there anything in your mind that you think our viewers and listeners ought to be looking towards, not just for the outcome, but maybe what it might tell us about the state of Canadian political life?
Yeah. Um, I will, of course, be interested just as an amateur observer at the participation levels.
Hmm.
That Those have, in Canada, like everywhere else, tended to decline. I don't think it's a sign of civic health when people
Hmm.
feel that they don't have efficacy in casting their vote. I think it is a sign of civic health when people do feel that their vote matters, because collectively they do. So I hope to see a big turnout, and that kind of symbolic recommitment to the processes of democracy. Let's hope for a big one, and I wish everyone a meaningful experience of participation.
Here, here. What a wonderful way to wrap up our conversation. And I should say to those American listeners and viewers joining us, if the advance polls over the weekend were any indication, we are going to have, if not historic turnout levels, certainly much higher than we've had in the past several elections. So your wishes may ultimately be rewarded, David. Thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to catching up next week.